And his girlfriend, who he was living with, she came along one Sunday to have a look. And she was like, he's into drink, he's been into drugs, now he's into religion. It's a fad, it will pass. And she runs a cafe up on the high street with loads of people that come to it, like big circle of people. And so she comes to visit us one Sunday, she looks at what we're doing, and she just laughs at us. She goes, this is ridiculous, it's never going to fly. And that night in her cafe, she tells everyone how stupid we are, and she laughs at us. And that night she had a dream, and in her dream the Lord Jesus appeared to her and said to her, don't mock my church.
Hi folks, welcome back to Raw Mission. This is the podcast where we hear the stories of ordinary men and women. They've experienced the goodness of God and they've responded to his call, his command, his invitation to take the good news to the least reached. Today I'm joined by Andy McCullough, a church leader and author in the UK who spent many years doing evangelism and church planting in Turkey, now called Turkiye. He'll be sharing about how a fellowship was started in Istanbul through a tattoo artist, his girlfriend, and a series of remarkable dreams. Well, good morning, Andy McCullough. So great to have you with us today on the show.
Yeah, morning. Nice to see you again.
We've met a couple of times, but I don't know much about your story, especially your sort of backstory growing up and coming to faith and getting into missions. So, yeah, take it away.
Yeah, sure. My parents are British. I was born and grew up in Cyprus, and that's because my parents were working in the mission space. So, in that sense, I'm a missionary kid, and of kind of carrying on the family business, I guess, now.
Yeah, that's right. What were they doing out there? Were they sort of church planting or doing care for the poor? Or?
Yeah, they were actually part of a whole load of people in the 70s who were working in the Middle East and based in Beirut. And then when the civil war happened in 75 in Lebanon, you had this kind of whole Middle Eastern mission community all decamp from Lebanon into Cyprus. So Cyprus was actually full of missionaries who didn't really want to be there. They actually cared about the Middle East. And I'm not saying that my parents didn't want to be in Cyprus, but like all these people had given all these years to learning Arabic, and then they all ended up in Cyprus and couldn't use their Arabic. And yeah, that was basically the 80s in the mission community in Cyprus.
Interesting. Okay, and I don't know much about Cyprus, but what was that like for you growing up there?
Cyprus is an incredible place. It's still divided, so it's the southern half is Greek and the northern half is Turkish. And it's 50 years this year since that happened in 74. And so it's interesting growing up in the Greek side of Cyprus. It's not quite Greek, it's not quite Middle Eastern, it's kind of in the corner of three continents. And the culture in Cyprus is like that, really. It's always been a bit of a meeting place. But I think what's interesting is a lot of people have always kind of used Cyprus for that. So used it as a bit of an aircraft carrier, used it as a bit of a kind of strategic jumping off space, rather than loving Cyprus for itself, loving Cypriot people for themselves.
So how old were you then? I mean, did you spend all your teenage years there? Did you sort of come to faith as a kid then and continue just sort of walking with the Lord? Yeah, what was the story?
I left Cyprus at 16. I actually got expelled from school. No. And it's quite a small place, so everybody knows everybody. And left then and came to the UK and did my A-levels in the UK. And it was when I came to the UK that I came to faith. So started going to church for myself and met with Jesus when I was 17. Yeah, and almost immediately from coming to faith, I had this sense of wanting to serve God in that bit of the world that I grew up in. So almost immediately thinking, there's no point being necessarily a Christian in the UK, just the kind of the math of gospel importance. So almost from that point, I was like, I'd rather have a small church of people in an unreached nation than a big church of people in a Christian nation, which I kind of just got into my spirit straight away, I think.
So did you go off and do further studies in theology or just normal university, or did you jump into life overseas?
I jumped into life overseas. So I went to India with OM and absolutely loved it. Loved being part of a team that was all Indian guys and I was the only foreign guy. And so again, just that sort of immersive thing of, it was like proper evangelism, knocking doors 6 days a week. And there's just everything about being part of a team that was locally led, locally run, and being there to, like, everything about that I loved. I think it just left me with this kind of one burning question, really, which was, we saw people come to faith during that time, tried to connect them to local churches, but obviously the relationship with the people that had come to faith was with us. And so then you try and pass them on to a local church. And so I think there I started asking questions about devoid of church planting and just trying to kind of make that make sense to me.
Yeah.
And so I think really it was out of that experience that I was like, okay, I think for me at least, church planting makes the most sense in terms of gathering community that are going to know each other and trust each other.
Okay, we'll come on to a bit more of that as we go, but just a couple more questions on India. What struck you about that year in India? What did you learn from the Indian team that you were working with? And which state, which part of India were you in? And Muslim focused, Hindu focused, or just a real mix?
Yeah, we were in Pune, so it's in Maharashtra. Most of the team was South Indian guys, as is often the way, who were living there together in community. I really loved, I think, in terms of Indian Christians and living in close connection with these guys, the prayerfulness. I think I really learned to pray there. You just saw kind of people's passion and devotion in prayer, staying up all night. And obviously it's kind of missionary space, so part of that is that, but part of that I think is just a kind of a spirituality that I hadn't seen until that point. And also kind of fullness of the Holy Spirit. So no one had really talked to me much about spirit-filled Christianity, if you like, but I think with these guys I was seeing something different, and it got me asking them lots of questions and going back to my Bible. And so I think there was those two things, the sort of which go hand in hand, but the prayerfulness and also a sort of an openness to the Holy Spirit, that was massive for me in terms of living in this community of Indian guys for a year.
In some ways, it's the Jesus model of discipleship, isn't it? You're out and you're living it, learning it, doing it on the ground, and seeing the sort of spiritual opposition probably at the same time. What are these spiritual gifts, in community, on the street, in outreach? Yeah, it's a really good way to learn rather than, you could argue, just, doing it academically through books.
Yeah, 100%. And I think also it was the fact that it was an Indian-led team, an Indian-shaped strategy. And so, I was just there as kind of cannon fodder. And I just think, again, that's so incredibly helpful in terms of trying to understand a place from the inside. Not that anyone ever can really understand a place from the inside, but I think, living with guys who were passionately giving their life to this, it had a huge impact on me.
And effectively, they were cross-cultural missionaries too, if they've come from South India and they're working up in Pune.
Exactly.
So good for the Indian context. What were the hardest things about that year? Because India is not an easy place.
Yeah, I got really sick a couple of times. And to be honest, that's become part of our training and strategy for people, is you will get sick. There's spiritual warfare, but there's also kind of microbial warfare. Your body's not used to a place, and you need to budget for chunks of time when you're ill. But I think that was hard because you're far away and you're on your own and you're feeling really ill and you're in hospital or whatever. So I think, those kind of things, are definitely part of the story.
And any reflections on, as a Western white guy in India, I wish I'd known this before I went?
I wish that someone had compelled me to learn some language, even if I was there short term. I just think in terms of what it does, showing people honor and being able to connect. And I know there's a limit to what you can do on a short term thing, but I wish that someone had persuaded me harder on that.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Even a few sentences, greetings and things can go a long way, can't they? So what happened after India?
So I wanted to stay. I was offered a job in Delhi working with Afghan refugees, which I just would have loved. And sometimes I think, what if I'd stayed? I'd probably still be there. But I felt led, actually, for the first time really clearly in my life, in terms of feeling God speak to me about coming to London to study. So I came to London, and whilst in London met Jess, who we got married to 3 years later. So kind of spent that 3 years at university, involved in a local church in London, and getting to know Jess. So
Nice. What did you study?
Environmental science. So I was thinking very much the kind of the development route to being able to use that for the gospel.
Nice. And Jess isn't from the UK, is she?
No, she's from South Africa. So yeah, I'd just moved to London and she'd just moved to London from South Africa. And we met at church. Actually, we had the same first Sunday at church. So we both turned up as visitors and there was a lunch afterwards for like new people. So we both went to the lunch and met each other and realized that we were both new. So we were chatting and these two old ladies took her aside and said, "We don't know that man." And they warned her off me. No. But then 3 years later, when we announced our engagement in the church, the same two old ladies were like, "Oh, we knew it from the first time you met." And we're like, "No, you liars, you warned her off me." But we did invite them to the wedding anyway.
Nice. Okay, so you've done your year in India, you've now done some studies, you've got married. Was Jess always behind this idea of going overseas again? Was that always on your mind?
It was always on my mind. I think for her, serving God was very much on her mind. So although the cross-cultural thing wasn't necessarily, I think the idea of being all in for Jesus, whatever that meant, very much was. We had this unusual thing where when I was 19, I'd been in a meeting where we were praying about our sense of call and wanting to do something for God. And the guy leading the meeting had said, "For some of you, God is actually going to speak to you about a time scale and it's really going to help you. So just close your eyes and pray." And in that moment, I was 19, I closed my eyes and I just had this sense of 11 years. So I opened my eyes and I did some maths and I was like, I'll be 30. And then I was like, Jesus began his ministry at 30. Joseph became prime minister at 30. David became king at 30. I thought, oh, that's a good biblical number. And what it did was it kind of settled me down to going, okay, I'm going to give some time to being in London, to church planting in London, to kind of building marriage and having our children and whatever God has for us so that we can kind of prepare to move cross-culturally at 30. And that's what happened in the grace of God. That was the way that the timescale worked out.
That's really interesting. All right. So were you always in New Frontiers churches in London in those younger days?
Yeah. So when I moved to London, I joined a New Frontiers church for the first time. And I think what I appreciated was this sense of being part of an international family of churches and very much the kind of the mission and particularly church planting emphasis. So I think that's what I really appreciated about, I was in a little New Frontiers church in London, but they're talking about kind of church planting on the other side of the world, but they're talking about the people that they know in other places as family, and we're praying for them as family, and people are coming through and sharing stories, which I still appreciate today about the New Frontiers space. But this connection between my sort of local church life and this feeling of being part of a global family and what that does in terms of not just perspective, but honoring people from other nations and other backgrounds and leaders in other spaces, but then also the kind of the pull that creates in terms of mission perspective. So I think for me, being in the New Frontiers space, I've really appreciated that set of connections.
Yeah, that's really cool. So probably in the late 90s, you and I would have, not knowing each other, but would have been at some of those Stoneleigh Bible Weeks. I remember some of those times, and they'd have all the flags, and there'd be one evening especially where they'd really highlight the nations of the earth, wouldn't they? And the guys would, I remember the Pakistani pastor grabbing the Pakistani flag and running around and people just praying for the different countries. Very powerful. And I knew at that stage I was heading towards Pakistan, nothing to do with you guys and your church network, but yeah, that's quite cool.
Yeah, definitely. And we were part of a church plant in West London, in a very multicultural bit of West London. We were living in Southall, which is kind of Little India. So we were the only white people on our street. All our friends at work and in our community and stuff were all from Asian backgrounds. So that was very much our kind of space in West London. And that's where we had our kids. They grew up there. And yeah, that church is still going really well today. It's a beautiful church, actually.
Nice. So that begs the question, how come you didn't end up in South Asia?
Yeah, it's funny. I never had a particular sense of call to a place. It was more to a bit of the world. And I think my bit of the world is, I guess, anywhere between Istanbul and Delhi. That's the bit that's kind of tattooed on my heart, I suppose, for whatever reason, how God does these things. So I think we could equally have ended up in Pakistan or Afghanistan, got a lot of people that we love in those places and from those places, at Central Asia, Middle East, and then Turkey, which is where we did end up. So, yeah.
Yeah, so tell us about the journey to Turkey then.
Yeah, well, we were getting close to 30 years old and thinking, oh, well, this was our kind of time frame that we'd felt from the Lord. So we started exploring within the New Frontiers family what it would look like to move. And we didn't know where. And so it was really through a process of conversation, particularly with those that would be kind of overseeing. We felt quite clear on wanting to go and be part of a church planting team. We felt quite clear on wanting to go and learn language and be based somewhere a long time and plant something that would be in the local language. And we felt quite clear on wanting to be sent. So in that sense, we were quite open-handed to guys going, where do you feel God's doing something? Where have you been praying for? And it was in that process that the guys within New Frontiers that were looking at that bit of the world said, well, would you explore Istanbul? We've been praying about Istanbul and we'd never been there. Well, no, I had been there when I was younger, but Jess had never been there. So we went together for a weekend to kind of pray and explore, and you know what it's like, those kind of little weekends where you're really feeling the pressure and everyone back home is waiting for an answer. And you're desperately going, I want to hear from God here. And, you know, so without any real sense of, oh, we've massively heard from God, we came back and I was like, yeah, I think we could do this. And Jess was like, well, I really want a sign in the sky, because we had 4 young kids. It's a big deal. So Jess was like, I'd really actually like to hear from God quite clearly. And so this was the October. I'm kind of secretly praying that God will speak to her by Christmas, but without putting pressure on her. So she's up for it, but she's just like, I'd really like a sign that says go to Istanbul or something. And then one day she is just reading the Bible and praying and thinks, do you know what? I think I should take a faith step here and just say yes. So she sends me a text message that says, Turkey, it's a yes. And we'd been talking that morning about what we were going to have for Christmas dinner. So I think I messaged back saying, do you mean for life or just for Christmas? So she'd kind of done this in faith and gone, okay, God, I'm trusting you. I'm going to say yes to this even though. But then she went out after sending that text message. She went out on a school run and got stuck in traffic behind a taxi. And on the back window of the taxi, they had one of these adverts for your summer holiday that said in big letters, go to Turkey.
Way.
So she was like, isn't it interesting, God? I was asking for a big sign and I've kind of taken my step of faith first, my step of obedience first. And then immediately afterwards, you've given me the sign that I was asking for. So I think, isn't God kind?
Yeah, there've been times, you know, we don't always ask for that, but there are times it's okay to say, Lord, you know me, you know, my current situation, I just need something. And yeah, he's so often gracious and sometimes in ways we don't expect.
And moving with four kids under 6. So it's a big deal to a place where you don't know anyone and, you know, all of that.
Yeah. Do you go to join a team, with a team? Did you start a team or were you going to sort of work with an existing local church?
We started a team. So we recruited a team to go. So we ended up with 5 families, 3 from the UK, 2 from the US. So we moved together. Everyone was going to learn Turkish for 2 years in different ways, you know, depending on their life stage and all the rest of it. And then looked to start a Turkish speaking church after we'd been there for 2 years. So everyone had a different track on language. I went to Istanbul University and studied Turkish for 2 years. So different people did different things. Some people were full-time, some people were bivocational, you know, some people were working. So there's a whole mix in the team. A lot of kids, so 10 adults and 17 kids between us. So then we'd been there 2 years and obviously you've been praying and meeting and exploring and all the rest of it and getting to know some people. And you've got to remember Istanbul is an extraordinarily unchurched city. So there are a few Turkish churches that are, you know, well known and of good reputation and established. But there are huge areas of the city, millions of people with no churches. So, you know, deciding where we were going to plant was partly in conversation with the existing Turkish church. And you could almost just pick a spot on a map because there's just huge areas where there are no churches. And so we ended up planting in a part of the Asian side of Istanbul where there were no churches at all. And how do you start from nothing with a bunch of foreigners, right? So we rented a venue, we put up a website, and we kind of went, okay, there's a church here. Let's see if anyone comes. Time we'd made a lot of Turkish friends, but we hadn't seen anyone come to faith within the 2 years, really. And someone gave us one of those prophetic words, which is the kind of classic prophetic word I think that a lot of church plants get, which is God's going to give you someone who is very well connected, very influential, kind of person of peace. And you're a little bit like, yeah, maybe, but like every church plant gets that prophetic word, right? And then this guy gets in touch with me through our website, and he's a very well-known, very well-connected, very influential tattoo artist. Wow. And in fact, he was the sort of first tattoo artist to open a high-profile shop in Turkey, and he does all the tattoos for all the footballers and the pop stars and the mafia. And he's discipled lots of other young tattoo artists who've gone around Turkey to open shops. So he's like an apostolic tattoo artist, if you like. And this guy called Hakan gets in touch and he says, my Alcoholics Anonymous thing, they tell us to think about God. So I looked online and I saw that you've opened a church just around the corner from where I am. Can I come and ask about God? And I am ready to become a Christian. I've only got one question, which is, if I become a Christian, where are you going to bury me?
Wow.
Which was huge because we'd never really thought about burial. You kind of said, well, in England, we just burn people. But, you know, if you've read your Bible, in the Middle East, burial is quite important. But obviously there's no Christian graveyards, no Protestant graveyards in the city. So he said, if I become a Christian, I don't want to be buried in a Muslim graveyard, but that's the only option here. So it's really interesting, like a question that we weren't expecting. But anyway, so he started coming. So now on Sundays, we are a load of foreigners and one Turkish guy trying to do everything in Turkish. So trying to sing in Turkish and pray in Turkish and preach in Turkish. And just the level was not great. And his girlfriend, who he was living with, she came along one Sunday to have a look. And she was like, he's into drink. He's been into drugs. Now he's into religion. It's a fad. It will pass. And she runs a cafe up on the high street with loads of people that come to it, like big circle of people. And so she comes to visit us one Sunday. She looks at what we're doing and she just laughs at us. She goes, this is ridiculous. It's never going to fly. And that night in her cafe, she tells everyone how stupid we are and she laughs at us. And that night she had a dream. And in her dream, the Lord Jesus appeared to her and said to her, don't mock my church. Which, when I heard about it, I was like, phew, Jesus is owning us as his church. We weren't quite sure he was embarrassed of us. And you've got to remember, these are people with no gospel context at all, no box for Christianity at all.
Presumably they're not really practicing Muslims anyway, these guys.
Correct. Like a lot of Istanbul Turks, secular Muslims, quite atheistic in many ways. And she said, the Lord showed her his hand, and in his hand there was a wound. And then he said, give me your hand. So she gave her hand to the Lord in this dream, and he touched her. And she said, when he touched me in the dream, I felt shame. I felt pain. I wanted the ground to open up and swallow me. And when he took his hand away, there was a mark on her hand, a wound. And when she woke up in the morning, it was still there. So she came to find me and she said to me, Andy, this happened. I laughed at you. I had a dream. Lord touched me. Look at my hand. What do you think it means? And I said to her, I don't know. It doesn't happen in England. I said, I don't know. Maybe he wants to speak to you. Tonight before you sleep, you should ask him for another dream. So she said that night when she lay down, she prayed for the first time in her life. Lord, if you're real, please give me another dream. This was the January. And for 3 months, every night, she had a dream about Jesus. Turkish people love soap operas. And she said it was like a soap opera, like she'd go to bed and go, I'm getting the next episode tonight. And she would often come and see me in the day and tell me about her dream. And then we would read the Bible together to reflect on it. So she would say, last night, I saw Ezekiel and the glory was leaving the temple and I felt really sad. Why did I feel so sad? So she'd come in and we'd open up that story and we'd read it. And she had phenomenal revelation in this 3 months. But she was a very stubborn lady, so it took 3 months for the Lord to break down her resistance, I suppose. And at the end of that time, on the Easter Sunday, she gave her life to the Lord. Now, within that window, 5 other people from their immediate circle had come to faith. So we then baptized this whole group of people together. So Hakan and his girlfriend, who became a fiancée, who became his wife, and 5 people from their circle. And that was the beginning of this church in Istanbul, which is now still going really well.
That's amazing. So this church from the very beginning was public. Was that always your thought? Well, we can do this publicly. The government don't mind. And is that still the sort of situation today? It's a bit mixed, isn't it, Turkey? You never quite know what's going on.
Yeah, it's always a little bit of a grey space between sort of legal and illegal, and between public and cautious. But the vast majority of kind of have chosen the public route. They prefer that, and also see it as a clearer evangelistic opportunity, because for Turks to explore faith, to come into a building, feels more authentic, less kind of suspicious. And so actually, I think for a lot of Turks, even though it can attract negative attention, I think Turks often seem to like the public Christian profile. And you can still get your ID changed from Muslim to Christian in Turkey. Yeah. And a lot of people do that. A lot of people will experience levels of persecution, lose their job, have difficulty with their family, face threats, depending on what family, what background they've come from. But as the church continues to kind of battle through that and grow into a second generation in Turkey, it's like they're gaining more traction, more acceptance culturally. Yeah. Oh, there is such a thing as a Turkish Christian.
That's really interesting. That's very different to my context in Pakistan, where, technically there's freedom of religion, but in any real sense, you can be Christian, you can come from a Christian community, but many of those who come from a Muslim background will either just keep their faith very secret, or they'll suddenly appear someone else and just say, I'm Christian. But they won't say that they used to be Muslim in a different community, because that really could bring down the sword on them, metaphorically speaking.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the other things that we learned, and you even see it in the story I just told, is the importance of not just baptizing one individual and extracting them from their support network, but kind of waiting until there's a family unit or a circle of friends, and then baptizing them together so that they can support each other. And that was something that we have seen repeatedly in different Middle Eastern spaces, is almost this wisdom piece or this faith piece to go, there's one person that's come to faith here, and we could just kind of suck them out of their community into church life. But if we can just wait a little bit and trust God, then maybe there'll be a few more that come to faith, and then they can cheer for each other.
That's so important, not just for their own strength, encouragement, stability, but also it means they bond to each other as the new believers, rather than bond to a pre-existing, in the Pakistan context, it would be a pre-existing Christian community, which separates them from their old community, or, and even worse, maybe an international community. And there's, sometimes you just have to do that. But the benefit of, we have a core group that can be who they are together and not lean on the foreigners too much. Amazing. Yeah, there's much more chance of it spreading.
Yeah, and in the Turkish church, family becomes really important, because what a lot of people lose is family. And so the kind of the New Testament metaphor of church as family really comes to the front. And so many Turkish churches, even though they're kind of small, would be very strong on things like hospitality and just come and live with us. When you come to faith, if your dad throws you out, come and live with us for a while. We'll support you, we'll cheer for you, we'll try and get you a job somewhere. So that whole family ownership piece becomes really, really important.
Yeah, and that's so important today in Britain, isn't it? Because we're seeing more and more Muslims come to Christ in Britain, but I don't know if the church is quite ready for what that means. It's fine. Yeah, of course we want to baptize someone in the church here, but are we ready as the church to, if they're kicked out of their homes and, communities, then to take them on, to take them in?
Yeah, 100%. My daughter was staying with one of the Turkish churches last year, just on holiday. She went and spent some time with them. And she said what was amazing was she could often not work out whose house she was in, because different people would sleep in different houses. So she was like, is this your house? Is this your house? She could often not work out which car belonged to whom, because one day someone would drive it, the other day someone else would drive it. The cars seemed to be sort of the public property of the church. And she said it was even true with the babies. She couldn't work out whose baby was whose. And you just think, oh, that feels very Acts chapter 2, doesn't it? Very New Testament. And yeah, there's something that's a bit more just naturally Turkish about that. But there's also something that's a response to, well, all of these people have lost so much through their choice to follow Jesus, that the church is being the things that they've lost.
Yeah. Sharing this podcast is a really good way to encourage more people to get involved with God's great mission, whether locally or globally. Perhaps you know someone whose faith might be strengthened, or God's call to evangelism and disciple-making might be ignited by listening to this very episode. So do share it or any of your favorite episodes with your friends. If you use an iPhone, it's really easy to give us a 5-star rating or to write us a review, and that has a big impact on how many people can find us. And finally, some of you have contacted us to ask if you can give financially to the work that we do. That would be a huge blessing to us as we get out and about speaking of God's heart for all nations, for the lost and for those who have no gospel witness. A simple way to do that is to go to our website, frontiers.org.uk, and to click the Give button at the top. Thanks, guys, and now let's get back to the interview. Do you have any anecdotes from those early days of individuals who got, some pretty nasty persecution, or just, I don't know if that might be too strong a word, but what kind of things have you seen out there?
Yeah, I mean, some of those stories are a bit harder to tell in the public space, I think, but a lot of people experience, various levels of losing their job, having their family disown them. It becomes really difficult when it comes to things like people trying to find someone to marry, because the Christian community is so small. So that things like that become a real pressure point, as well as, the economy is really bad. So it's very difficult for people to trust God to maintain their Christian witness when it means it's much harder for them to get a job. Military service becomes a really difficult thing for a lot of the young guys, because military service is compulsory. If you've declared your faith and changed your ID card before you go to military service, that can be really hard for people. But I think one of the other areas that is a very real thing is the spiritual warfare piece, or the kind of demonic piece. In fact, we would say the vast majority of people that came to faith with us did so where their first contact with the church was asking for healing or asking for deliverance or struggling with a demonic problem, and that's the reason that they reached out. And the way it would often work in the bit of Istanbul where we were, and I'm not saying this is universal, but this was very much our experience and still is, was that someone would have a demonic problem and they would go to the mosque, because that's what you do, and the Hodja would try and do something and it wouldn't work. And then he would go, aha, this demon is not a Muslim demon, this is a Christian demon. So it won't listen to my authority, so you have to go and find a Christian priest. So one day we had a lady turn up at our venue carrying an enormous silver cross and looking in a really bad way. And she kind of came in just muttering to herself, I can't bear it anymore. I can't bear it anymore. He beats me. He beats me. And we were like, welcome, sit down, have a cup of tea, tell us your story. And she said, this is my story. I live on my own. At night times, there's a demon that comes and beats me. And she lifted up her shirt and she showed us bruises. And she was like, look, these bruises are from me being attacked last night. And she said, so I went to the mosque and the Hodja said, oh, this is a Christian demon. It won't listen to me. You need to find a priest. Mm-hmm. So I went to the nearby Catholic church and they gave me this enormous silver cross and said, when the demon comes, fend it off with this big cross. And she said, I tried that and it didn't work. So then I Googled desperately and I found you guys. So I've come to you. Can you help me? So again, we did what we always do, which is we said, we'll gladly pray for you. Here's a story about Jesus casting a demon out of a woman and setting her free. But we're not going to pray for you on your own. We'd like there to be some family members here so that they can see what God does for you. So is there someone you can call? So she calls her mum, her aunt. So they come and then we all pray together. And so when she is delivered, she's got family members that have witnessed it and witnessed our kindness and non-judgmentalism and our care and hospitality. So that then in due course, when she came to faith and other members of her family came to faith, there's kind of senior members of her family that can vouch for us and say, these are good people, they're not manipulating her. We were there, we saw them, pray for her.
They didn't take money.
Massively. So that whole piece of like making it normal, making it family, embedding it in just hospitality, reading scripture, all of those pieces become so important in terms of trying to establish a local reputation in a place where Christians are looked at really badly, to try and go, well, look, these people are doing their best to be humble, kind servants in the community.
Yeah. I think it is important to think about. It might be uncomfortable for us who aren't used to that kind of thing, but there are these countries where we go and live, they're fully aware of demonic stuff and spiritual stuff, aren't they? And we have to be able to know the scriptures and be confident of who we are in Christ, be ready to deal with some of the stuff if it's exposed in front of us. Yeah, very important.
Yeah, for sure. But also I reckon I've learned more about that kind of ministry, so deliverance ministry, from Middle Eastern Christians. So there's a Lebanese pastor that I learned a lot from, and there's a Turkish guy that I learned a lot from, who are just very experienced and very gifted in this area. And so I think, like always, it's the kind of thing where you may not have the tools from your UK church background, but that there are tools and experience out there in the global church, and it's important to find them.
Yeah, good. So early stages of a church forming there on the eastern side of Istanbul. What happened after that?
Well, I think we were very clear that the goal was, the sort of Hudson Taylor thing, that foreign workers are scaffolding and they'll be dismantled, and the goal needs to be a local church with local leadership. So I think we were always very clear on that, and that being the end goal, and getting to that as soon as we could, basically getting out the way as quickly as possible. And I think the other thing was, I'd felt the Lord speak to me about doing the same model 3 times within 10 years. So seeing another team come from outside, learn language for a couple of years, and then plant a church in another part of Istanbul, and then again a third one. And so we were also working on the sort of recruiting piece for that to happen as well. And so we were there for 7 years only, and within that time, the church that we were leading came through to a mixed eldership team of a couple of Turkish guys and a couple of foreign guys. And it's now led by one of the Turkish guys who came to faith with us. So he's only been a believer for 10 years now, but he's leading the church because he's a more matured believer than everybody else. And he's also an older guy. And so the whole church is people that have come to faith in the church, like new Christians. And then, we've seen the same thing happen in a couple of other places in Istanbul as well within that window on a similar kind of idea.
That's great. Yeah, brilliant. So you sort of felt, okay, we've pioneered something, we've modeled something, and now the locals can take it on from here and hopefully have a vision to keep pushing on and pushing outwards.
Yeah, definitely. And then I think we were thinking, we would move on and do it again somewhere else. But then we had a few kind of major family health issues that actually meant we needed to jump out and come to the UK, which, like so often in these things, was going to be for a short time. It has ended up being for a longer time. But in the wisdom of God, like always, it's been the right thing for our family, and it's been the right thing for the ministry that we're doing as well, because it means we're now positioned to serve a bit more widely into some other spaces as well. But also it renegotiates your relationship with the local church, like the local believers there. And so I would say some of the guys there are my closest friends, and it's really nice that I'm not in the way, and that they get to lead and be Turkish leaders and see things develop in a really contextually appropriate way. Roland Allen famously said, they may not administer it according to your preferences, but I fail to see what your preferences have to do with the matter, which I just think is a classic Roland Allen thing, but really, really important in these kind of conversations.
Yeah, that's good. Andy, before we move on to sort of what your role is now in terms of writing and speaking and mobilizing in the UK for Global Mission, what would you say, and any tough things personally for you? You mentioned, family had some illness and you had to come back to the UK, but what were some of the hardest things about living out there?
Yeah, I think for the most part, we actually really loved living in Istanbul. Like, it's a fantastic city. I would say our experience was fairly middling in terms of there are people that have much worse times and probably people that have much better times. I think for us, the biggest challenges have always been our sort of internal health challenges within our family. So I've got 4 kids. 2 of my boys are on the autistic spectrum. One of them has quite complex needs. And it was only really as he got older that became clearer. So we had a lot of challenges, access to medical support and all those kind of things for him. And so I would say our biggest area of challenge for us has always been within our family, and particularly, our 2 boys.
And were they being homeschooled, or were you trying to put them in local schools or international schools?
No, we started with all our kids in Turkish school, and a couple of our kids went through Turkish school. But these 2 boys ended up transitioning into international school. But our 3rd child kind of kept dropping out. So we never homeschooled them. Jess was working. So I was full-time doing ministry stuff, and Jess was working a job in Istanbul as a teacher. And so I think, the kind of family dynamic was always the challenging piece for us, and still is today, to be honest.
Fair enough. And I mean, there are always pressures in the background, aren't there? Even if your scenario seems good and the government seem happy with what you're doing, and you're seeing some fruit, which is really encouraging. But in the background, you've always got those stories of others across Turkey. I mean, I've had Andrew Brunson on the show before and heard about his imprisonment and all his terrible years. And he was a pastor, an officially registered pastor, wasn't he, in Turkey from America? But those kind of things do hover in the background, don't they? Visa insecurity or other kinds of insecurities. So, I imagine some of that was going on.
Oh, for sure. And I think, 2019 was the big year for Andrew Brunson, but then also for many others across Turkey, in terms of many key leaders being thrown out and stuff like that. And by the grace of God, we'd left before that. Whereas, now it's I would say the visa insecurity is much harder now for people that were thinking now of moving to Turkey or something. I think it's a lot more complex.
We've heard that too, And of course, some local church leaders in fairly recent history still have been martyred for their faith, haven't they?
Yeah. It's coming up to 20 years, isn't it, that the Malatya guys lost their lives, and many people knew them, loved them. It's interesting with Turkey. Malatya is further east. I think you've still got a big east-west discrepancy where cities like Istanbul and Izmir and places on the west coast tend to have a much greater degree of freedom, whereas many places further east in Turkey are completely unevangelized or completely unchurched or have no Christian representation in province at all, and there's been a lot more mess and pain. I think the awful earthquake that happened just over a year ago in the Antioch region in southeast Turkey, the extraordinary thing about the response to that has been that it's been Turkish-led primarily. So there's a major earthquake in 1999 in the Istanbul region where most of the response from a Christian perspective was foreign-led. The big change in that time window has been now most of the response to the earthquake has been led by the Turkish church, and has been an extraordinary opportunity to witness, really. Some estimates would say that 50-60% of all Turkish Christians have been involved personally in the earthquake response. Wow. In terms of being down in that region, which, can you imagine 50% of the UK church being mobilized around some single issue? So you just think it's beautiful seeing the responsibility that there is in the Turkish church just across the difference of that 20-year time period.
Yeah, wow, that's really encouraging. So bring us up to speed with your current role. I know that you're leading what's called the Unreached Network, which is for the New Frontiers family of churches across. Would that be across this nation or broader than that?
Yeah, no, it's broader than that. I think with the Unreached Network, we're basically trying to facilitate a conversation in good practice across the wider New Frontiers family. And the vast majority of New Frontiers churches are in the global south rather than in the UK. And so I think there you've got conversations about, it's basically like an exchange platform where people are sharing their learnings, their ideas, their insights. So the blog on there is like a community blog. Different people are reflecting from different places on what they're learning about mission. And within that, there's an internship program, which is your kind of cross-cultural exposure year type thing, and loads of other sort of training resources and things like that. So we're doing that, which is serving across, it's not just the New Frontiers family, other people are allowed to use it as well, but the kind of the primary target group is sort of New Frontiers churches. So we're doing that. I'm one of the pastors in my local church here in Reading. I'm also hands-on involved in serving some church planting teams that are cross-cultural in the Middle East region. So I'm doing that. And then I'm also working with some local churches in different bits of, sort of the Eastern Mediterranean and Western Asia region, which is helping to support and cheer for and equip and connect kind of locally led works. And then as part of that as well, I'm doing more and more kind of writing and teaching and training in the UK in terms of the mission conversation, but more than that, the overlap between kind of the missiology stuff, but listening to the global church, this kind of piece of the conversation where it's like mission space shouldn't just be people making it up in the West and figuring out what they think people need, but listening to people in different places and going, well, what's your perspective? What do you need? So the global theology piece as well, which I'm really enjoying. I did my master's at All Nations in contextual theology, and just, I love the environment at All Nations, but I think the big plus is the fact that you've got voices from around the world teaching and training you.
Yeah, so tell us about some of the books you've written and the focus of those, and especially your latest book on John's Gospel.
Yeah, my latest book's coming out in July. It's called Made Flesh, and it's John's Gospel, mission, and the global church. So it's taken some of the stories from John's Gospel, by no means a commentary. It's more devotional than that. So some of the stories from John's Gospel, it's reflecting on what they have to say to us about mission, but then it's also doing that, listening to voices from the global church. So there's anecdotes and commentary and insights and observations from Christians around the world on John's Gospel. So what I hope is that it will enrich people's reading of John. Like they'll go, oh, I never saw that before. Because that's what global perspectives do, isn't it? They unlock different ways of seeing. I hope that it will inspire people around mission, and particularly John's kind of compelling of mission, where he tells the story and then he says, right at the end, Jesus breathed on them and said, receive the Holy Spirit as the Father sent me, so I'm sending you. So it's like everything that you've seen in the mission of Jesus is now your responsibility. So I hope it will enrich, inspire, delight, edify, and honor global voices as well.
Yeah, that sounds brilliant. How did you get those global voices? Are they just friends and connections of yours from around your travels?
Yeah, some of it is people that I've interviewed from around the place. A lot of it is scholarship, so different commentaries written from different places, or kind of works that have been done on John in different countries, kind of across the world. So so there's a lot of different perspectives, but with all of it, I think I try and have them quite well referenced, because I think often you read a little book like this and you go, oh, that's an introduction to this voice. It's an introduction to this voice. I can go and read more of that person or this person and kind of follow the bibliography. So I think it's really, really important increasingly for people to understand that you shouldn't just read Christian books written by people who look like you, and that basically they only argue within limited confines and talk about certain things. And sometimes it's so helpful to have voices interacting with the same scriptures but from a completely different perspective, because it just makes you go, whoa, like the Bible's bigger than I thought it was, the world's bigger than I thought it was, God's bigger than I thought he was, the church is more beautiful than I thought she was.
No, that's so good. And that's, one of the sort of legacies of John Stott, wasn't it? The Langham Partnership. And of course, my former tutor and principal at All Nations was Chris Wright, who's taken on a lot of that. And I tell you what, we'll shove some of those things in the podcast notes as well, actually, about the kind of, your book, definitely, and then some other ideas for people if they want to explore global voices, theology, and mission. Great. Okay, final thoughts, perhaps, as we wind up here. Andy, what would you say, or what do you say probably, when you go around to different churches and get the opportunity to speak and preach? What do you say to church leaders who feel a little bit buried in their own local communities and don't naturally think too much about the ends of the earth? You've had all this experience, you've met all these people, and you've caught God's heart for the nations. That third of the world that's never really had the gospel, or doesn't have a gospel witness to this day. So, what would be your message to our listeners and in churches where this isn't really a big focus?
I think the only way of persuading Christians about something is persuading them that it's important in the Bible. And so I think the Bible is compelling in its global vision. And I think the Bible is compelling in its call to all believers and the responsibility that it puts on all believers to understand that they're part of a global body at the very least, but to also understand that their responsibility, the Acts 1:8, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, ends of the earth peace. And yet in a book like Acts, it takes 8 chapters before they get out of Jerusalem. And so I think it's very kind of normal in the human experience to be focused in your local. Mm-hmm. But I think that God has something more that is both challenging but also thrilling to get out of Jerusalem and into the kind of the next spaces beyond that. And I think, we can't be too hard on ourselves if even the apostles who had been with Jesus took 8 chapters to get out of Jerusalem.
Yeah, and it was by persecution that scattered them mostly as well.
Yeah, and it wasn't even the Hebraic guys, it was the Hellenistic guys, Stephen and Philip, and they were the guys that really understood that the problem was this essentially faulty theology. They were still focused on the temple, they were still meeting in the temple courts. It's only when Stephen preaches against the temple in Acts 7 and gets killed for it that it kind of cracks open their closed worldview. And so I agree that God is determined to get us out of our own heads and out of our own spaces, both for the good of the world, but also for the good of us. It's good, it's healthy for the church. It lets more oxygen in it. It's that classic thing. Is the book of Jonah, is it about God saving Nineveh or is it about God saving Jonah? Well, it's a bit of both, isn't it? And so I think it's good. I think it's good for us. I think it's good for our churches.
That's a really important point, because I think a lot of fear might be involved where we don't want to lose some of our good people because the church here is sort of needing them and the UK needs them and so on. But it's a very kingdom thing, isn't it, to actually release and trust that God will replace and bless your church in the giving away of not just prayer, time, money, but actually of some of your people as well.
Yeah, and churches will always say, look, in the long term, it's been good for us because mission is discipleship. It trains the heart, it enlarges the vision. And so actually our connection now with this project or this ministry or these people in another part of the world has really enriched our church. There is a giving and receiving that happens that I think is intrinsically New Testament. I'll leave this as my final thought, but one of the New Testament Greek words I've been really enjoying is the Greek word is synergos, so co-work or co-working. It's where we get the English word synergy. But in the New Testament, it's horizontal. So you've got Paul has co-workers in mission, and he talks about other churches having this kind of mutual relationship. But it also talks about God working with us. So in chapters like at the end of Mark, it says they went out and preached everywhere and God worked with them, confirming his word through signs and wonders. And so I think there's something beautiful about there's a synergy in mission between us and God. We work and he works with us, or he's working and we're with him. But then also a mutuality and synergy between churches in different places, kind of strengthening each other, encouraging each other, enlarging each other. So this grace of giving and receiving, of co-work, of mutuality and exchange, I think is exactly what the church in the 21st century should be about.
Yeah, definitely. And I came across some verses that really struck me a year or so ago about Paul saying this gift of apostleship. We're not saying to people, hey, we really need some more people to take the gospel to the ends of the earth. It's not that. We're not begging. Actually, the Holy Spirit is saying, come, I have a gift for you, for your church, for your leaders, for those who are going to respond. There's a gift on offer here to work with God, just what you're saying, and to partner with him, because God is a missionary God, as John Stott would say. And the Bible is a missionary book. You can't take mission out of the Bible. So, yeah, brilliant. Andy, thank you for sharing your story with us. Yeah, and may the Lord bless you in all that you're doing with your own family of churches across and around the world. Definitely mission is very much the whole world into the unreached world these days. So your work reflects that, and I'm sure your book will be really encouraging to us, and we'll put those resources in the notes, definitely. Yeah, thanks for being with us, and God bless you.
Thanks very much. Take care. Bye.
Thanks so much for joining us today, guys. Do get in touch if you want to share how God is speaking to you through the podcast, Or if you want to partner with us in raising up more workers for the harvest, you can email me personally, matt@frontiers.org.uk. Here's a great quote to end with from Chris Wright. Mission arises from the heart of God himself and is communicated from his heart to ours. Mission is the global outreach of the global people of the global God. Have a great week and hope to see you next time.